The last thing the Kethai remembered of her was the sound of the mountain eating her alive. They had named her Waugar, which in the old tongue meant something close to the one who does not fall. It was the kind of name a people give to someone who has never given them reason to doubt it, not a boast but a simple observation, the way you name a river after the direction it flows. Waugar, High Queen of the Kethai, widow of Carol the Iron Hand, mother of the Bloodroots clan, had in 43 years of life never once fallen before an enemy. She had taken 3 blades and kept walking. She had buried a husband, a daughter, and an entire season's worth of grief in the permafrost beneath the shattered ridges, then stood back up and led her people into spring. So when the Veil Khan came with their war machines and their sky-burning weapons and their absolute certainty that the world of the Kethai was theirs to take, the Kethai had done what they always did when the impossible walked through their valley. They looked to Waugar, and she had not fallen. Not in the first wave, when the Veil Khan's atmospheric landers punched down through the overcast like dark fists and disgorged their soldiers in full resonance armor, soldiers who stood 2 heads taller than any Kethai and carried weapons that turned flesh to vapor at a range of 400 strides. Not in the second wave, when the northern settlements burned and the sky lit amber for 3 nights running and children arrived at the mountain doors with their feet bleeding and nothing left behind their eyes. Not in the siege, when the Veil Khan blockaded the high passes with their gravity-lock systems and let 37 Kethai warriors bleed out against the automated perimeter trying to break through. She had kept standing. She had organized the deep warrens. She had rationed the cold stores and set the bone carvers to work sharpening things the Veil Khan had never thought to account for in their tactical models. She had personally led the raid on the supply depot at Cold Maw Crossing, coming back with 3 crates of resonance cells and a Veil Khan officer zip-bound across her shoulders like a sack of grain, who had subsequently told them a great deal about things like maintenance schedules and rotation intervals before the Kethai had no further use for him. She had not fallen until the mountain ate her. The Veil Khan had brought what their own officers called a disruption array, a weapon designed not to kill but to obliterate geology. It targeted stress fractures in the rock face above the Kethai's primary escape tunnel and sent a focused resonance pulse through 100 meters of granite. The mountain did not collapse so much as it inhaled. One moment Waugar was in the tunnel mouth, waving the last of her rearguard through, and then there was a sound like all the sound in the world being removed at once, and then there was nothing. The Veil Khan had done a perimeter sweep, found no body, logged her as confirmed dead in the seismic event, and updated their tactical files accordingly. They were thorough creatures, meticulous. They had a word for species like the Kethai primitives translated too loosely, but the sense was of something not yet evolved past the point of being a problem. They cataloged the known population, calculated sustainable extraction quotas, and began the process of converting the Kethai homeland into a resource processing zone. They gave it 6 months before they considered the matter settled. They had not at that point met the blood moon. She came back to herself by degrees, the way a fire comes back after the wind has done its worst. First there was pain, which was at least familiar. Then cold, which was more familiar still. Then the sound of water moving somewhere beneath her, and the smell of the deep rock, iron and old dark and something organic she had never been able to name but had known since childhood as the specific perfume of the mountain's interior self. She was alive. That was irritating in the abstract. She had made a calculation at the tunnel mouth that her death was the cost of the rearguard's survival, and she had paid it willingly and without flinching. She had expected the transaction to be final. Instead, she was lying in a pool of her own blood at the bottom of a rubble field in a deep cave system she vaguely recognized as the 3rd or 4th level below the old miner's warren, a system the Kethai had sealed off 2 generations ago when the air turned bad and left the whole labyrinth to whatever lived in the dark. There was a crack of light somewhere above her, emitting a thin, cold beam that told her she had been unconscious long enough for the day to turn. She did not waste time being grateful. Gratitude was for later. Right now she needed to assess the damage. Left leg bad, she could move the foot, but something in the upper thigh was grinding against something it shouldn't, and the movement produced a white flash behind her eyes that she filed under not helpful and set aside. Right arm, she couldn't feel it all for about 40 breaths and then suddenly could, which was its own category of experience. Her crown, the iron circlet of bonded ore that Carol had set on her head the day he died, that she had not removed since, was gone. Buried somewhere in the rubble above her, or crushed flat, or carried off by the mountain settling. That was the thing that made her stay still for a long moment, staring at the ceiling. The circlet was gone. She touched the bare skin of her forehead, the old ring of callus where the iron had rested for 6 years, and felt something she hadn't felt since the morning they lowered Carol into the permafrost. Then she put it away, the same place she put everything. She had work to do. The Veilcon operational commander was a being called Sekvethrin, and he had, in his estimation, seen everything there was to see of primitive species resistance. He had pacified 14 worlds across 3 star clusters. He had broken insurgencies that his superiors had called unbreakable. He had, on one memorable occasion, suppressed an uprising of beings who breathed methane and had no eyes, and somehow still managed to manufacture improvised explosive devices from processed atmosphere. He had logged that one as interesting and moved on. The Kethai were not interesting. They were large, that was notable, he supposed, from a purely aesthetic standpoint. The females in particular were built on a scale that sat somewhere between impressive and alarming, with the gray-green skin that suggested high heavy metal content in the local water, the double jaw structure that served a thermal regulation function, but that Veilcon soldiers inevitably found disturbing, and the eyes, amber yellow, with the deep vertical pupils that read as wrong to Veilcon nervous systems in ways that cultural conditioning couldn't fully override. Sekvethrin had stopped noticing this years ago. What he noticed instead was agricultural potential, high fertility lowlands, significant mineral deposits, atmospheric composition that was nearly optimal for the processing facilities his employers had contracted him to establish. The Kethai were an inconvenience, a manageable one. He had filed the confirmation of Waugar's death with something close to professional satisfaction. She had been, his tactical analysis admitted, something of an operational anomaly. The models had predicted pacification within 11 days of initial landing. She had stretched that to 4 months. His models had been updated accordingly to account for the variable of indigenous leader with anomalous resistance parameters. And he had spent some time reviewing what she'd actually done: the counterlogistics, the adaptive fortification, the prisoner interrogation that had resulted in the loss of his second-in-command, with the grudging appreciation of a craftsperson examining another craftsperson's work. She was dead now. The mountain had solved that problem for him. He was in the middle of reviewing extraction projections when the first report came in from Outpost 7. 3 soldiers missing, no bodies, no resonance signatures. Equipment found neatly stacked beside the perimeter gate, which was precisely the detail that made him sit forward in his chair. The equipment had not been dropped in a struggle or left behind in a retreat. It had been set down with care, as if someone had wanted him to know that taking it had been incidental, not the point. The point, apparently, had been the soldiers. He sent a recovery team. He put the other outposts on elevated alert and increased perimeter scan frequency. He filed the incident under anomaly and waited to see if it repeated. It repeated. Over the next 9 days, 31 Veilcon soldiers disappeared from the outer perimeter in groups of 2 to 4, always during the night cycle, always leaving their equipment precisely arranged. His recovery teams found no tracks, which should have been impossible, given the sensitivity of the terrain sensors. His aerial surveillance caught nothing. His interrogation of nearby Kethi captives produced only silence, the particular quality of silence that he had learned to recognize as the silence of people who knew something that made them less afraid of him than he would like. On the 10th day, a supply convoy between Outpost 3 and the main processing facility was hit on the narrow pass above the Coldmaw tributary. 43 soldiers, 8 armored vehicles, standard convoy with full sensor suite and 2 forward scouts. The scouts came back. The 43 soldiers did not. But their equipment did. The wound in her leg had closed, which was perhaps the only honest miracle she had been given. Kethi flesh ran hot and healed fast, and the thigh she had set it herself in the dark, pressing the grinding bone back into alignment by feel while her vision went completely white, and she breathed through her nose in long, steady pulls and did not make a sound, because sound traveled in caves and she didn't yet know what was sharing the dark with her. It had healed crooked, which meant she would have a limp for the rest of her life. She had decided in that moment that the rest of her life could accommodate a limp. She had spent the first 2 weeks simply surviving, learning the deep cave system's geometry by feel and the thin light that crept in from the surface cracks, finding the underground streams where clean water moved through the limestone, hunting the blind fish that populated the deepest pools with a sharpened rock and a patience that surprised even herself. She slept in short intervals, never more than a few hours, with her back against the wall and her ears open. She thought in those early days about dying. Not the way a person thinks about dying when they are afraid. She wasn't afraid, particularly, of death itself. She had made peace with that transaction at the tunnel mouth. But the way a person thinks about dying when they are trying to calculate the cost of continuing to live. Every day she survived in the caves was a day she was consuming resources that would cost her people nothing if she simply stopped. Every day she survived was a day spent building herself back to fighting weight, which cost something but which produced an asset. She kept returning to the convoy routes. She had memorized them before the siege, back when she had still been running strategic operations from the mountain fortress. She kept returning to the way the Veilcon organized their perimeter, the intervals, the rotation schedules, the way their sensors were calibrated for large, noisy threats, and had apparently never been adjusted for something that moved like a Kethi female who had spent 30 years hunting in mountain terrain and 2 weeks learning to be invisible even to herself. She kept returning to the question of what one person, broken and half-healed and stripped of everything except knowledge, could do to something that had already won. The answer she arrived at eventually was not a comfortable one. It required her to become something she had not been since she was a girl learning the old ways from her grandmother in the deep forest. Not a queen, not a general, not even a warrior in any conventional sense. It required her to become a story. The Keth had a word for it, Vargoth. It meant approximately the one who was dead. It was the word for the ghost that would not stay buried, the ancestor who returned in dreams with blood on their hands and instructions. The Veilcon had very good tactical models. They had no model for Vargoth. She came out of the mountain at night, in the dark of the moon. She took what she needed. She left what she wanted them to find. Sekvethran stopped sleeping around the 30th day. It was not a decision, exactly. Sleep simply stopped coming. He would lie in his quarters in the operations facility, a pressurized module sealed against the cold mountain air, lit in the soft blue that Veilcon nervous systems found restful, and his mind would work. It would go over the incident reports. It would look for the pattern he had been trained to look for, the logic underneath the chaos, the strategic intent that would tell him what he was dealing with. What he was dealing with did not follow the patterns. It did not hit supply lines consistently. Sometimes it hit supply lines, and sometimes it hit morale positions, taking a single sentry from a post in a way that left every other sentry on that rotation sleeping badly for a week. It did not kill indiscriminately. His casualty figures, reviewed coldly, showed a selection logic he could almost but not quite decode. It seemed to prefer soldiers who had been involved in the northern settlement actions. It seemed, specifically, to prefer officers. It left things. That was the detail his analysts kept circling back to and couldn't explain away. A piece of resonance armor arranged carefully on the steps of a command post. A Veilcon tactical tablet placed in the exact center of the main processing facility's entrance, still functional, displaying the faces of 31 missing soldiers. A set of ration packs stacked outside the medical bay with a rough symbol scratched into the top one. His cultural database eventually identified it as a HFY character that translated to something like eat. The mockery would have been easier to process if it were only mockery. It wasn't. There was something underneath it, a communication of some kind, from something that understood precisely what it was doing, and had decided he needed to understand it too. He was being shown, with a precision that kept him awake at night, the specific dimensions of how badly his tactical models had failed him. He had started to piece it together around day 40. The pattern in the casualty selection, the specific locations targeted, the particular quality of restraint, because whatever this was, it could have killed more, and was choosing not to. It was choosing, instead, to demonstrate capability without exercising it fully, which was the behavior not of something vengeful but of something that was still, somehow, running a strategy. The HFY captives had a word they used in the rare moments they spoke at all. He had added it to his translation database 3 weeks ago and only recently found the entry, Vargoth, the one who was dead and returned. He had cataloged it as mythological reference, culturally significant, operationally irrelevant. He looked at it again now, in the blue light of the sleepless hour, and revised his assessment. She had gone back for the crown. It had taken her 6 days of careful excavation in the rubble field, working by feel in the utter dark of the sealed-off tunnel, moving rock by rock with the methodical patience of someone who had all the time left on the battlefield and none of it anywhere else. She had found it on the 7th morning, crushed out of true on one side, cold and heavy in her palm. She had straightened it as best she could against a rock edge, turning it back towards something that would sit on her head if not precisely fit, and then she had held it for a while in both hands, in the dark. Carol had given it to her the morning he died. He had known he was dying. It had taken 3 days after the wound, which had been plenty of time for arrangements. He had placed it on her head himself, sitting up in the sick room with the effort showing in the line of his jaw, and he had said the words in the old language that meant, "I give you everything I had, and everything I was, and everything I hope to become." And then he had lain back down, and she had sat beside him until he was done. She had not taken it off since. It had not seemed like the kind of thing you took off. She put it on now, crooked slightly from the repair, cold from the cave, a different weight from the one she remembered, which might have been the damage or might have been everything that had accumulated since the last time she'd assessed how things felt. Then she stood up and tested her crooked-heeled leg and went back to work. The blood moon rose on the 47th day. She had not planned it exactly. The HFY tracked the moon cycles by instinct and upbringing the way the Veilcon tracked orbital mechanics by computation. It lived in the body, not the head, and her body had known what night this was before her mind had caught up. The blood moon was not literally blood red, any more than the HFY were literally orcs, but in the Veilcon's visible spectrum, it rose with a deep rust-amber coloration from the atmospheric particulates, and it threw the mountain valley into a color that made the Veilcon soldiers, already sleeping badly, sleep worse. She had been building toward this for 3 weeks. Not consciously designing a spectacle, she was not, fundamentally, a theatrical person. Carol had been the one with the sense of story, but the logic of what she was doing had arrived here on its own. She had been demonstrating capability to Sec Vethrin in careful increments. She had been teaching him something. Now it was time to finish the lesson. She had, over the previous weeks, made contact with 7 Kethai survivors still hiding in the lower cave systems. Not the warrens, which the Veilcon had mapped, but the old miners' passages and the deep-water channels that her grandmother's grandmother had known and that existed in no Veilcon database. She had not recruited them. She had simply made herself visible to them, let them see what she was doing and understand that she was alive and doing it, and let them make their own choices. 5 of them had, gradually, begun doing versions of the same thing in their own areas. She had not given orders. She had just been the thing that made order seem possible. The 7th Kethai she had found was a girl named Drav, who was 12 years old, who had survived the northern settlement destruction by hiding in a root cellar for 11 days on the smell of stored tubers, and who had eyes that had seen things that should not have been visible to someone 12 years old. Drav had followed her at a distance for 4 days before making contact, and when she had made contact she had said, in the direct flat voice of someone who had run out of anything softening to pad the question with, "Are you actually her? Wowgar, not a story?" She had answered, "I am not a story yet. I am still just a person doing a job. The story is what other people make of it afterward." Drav had considered this with the gravity of someone weighing its exact truth value, and then she had said, "All right, what do you need me to do?" What she needed Drav to do, on the night of the blood moon, was deliver a message. Sekvethrin was in his office, reviewing the latest incident reports, when the girl appeared in his facility. Not at the gate, inside the facility, in the central corridor, standing 6 meters from his office door with her hands visible and empty, which is the only reason she was not immediately fired upon by the 4 soldiers who materialized at various points around her. She was 12 years old, roughly, gray-green and large for her age, and she was looking at him with the Kethai amber-yellow eyes that his nervous system still refused to fully process as non-threatening. She held out a rolled piece of material, treated hide. He registered, the kind the Kethai used for formal documents. He gestured for a soldier to retrieve it. The girl did not move or react to the soldier's proximity in any way, which was somehow more unsettling than if she had flinched. He unrolled the document. It was written in Veilcon Standard, which told him something immediately. His translation database was a Veilcon product. The Kethai language capability was its. Whoever had written this had either had access to a Veilcon tactical system or had spent weeks learning the language from documents captured in raids. Neither option was reassuring. The message read, "I know what you believe about what I am. I know what your models say about the cost-benefit analysis of continuing operations in this valley. I know your maintenance schedules, your rotation intervals, your communication frequencies, and the name of the officer in your chain of command who will receive your quarterly extraction report. I know these things because your systems are very thorough, and because I have had 47 days to learn from them. I am offering you an accounting. 31 soldiers at the outer perimeter, 43 in the convoy, 17 at the watch posts between Outpost 3 and Outpost 7. These are the ones you have counted. There are others you have not counted because you have not yet searched the right places. I am offering you a different calculation. You have contracted to deliver extraction projections to your employers in 17 days. You will not meet those projections. You have not met them for 6 weeks, and you will not meet them for the 6 months after this one, if you remain in this valley. I can guarantee this in a way that your tactical models cannot account for, because your tactical models have a gap in them where I am. I am not asking you to leave because I believe you will listen to reason. I am asking you to leave because I am going to give you a reason that your employers will accept, and because the alternative is that I continue to demonstrate to you, with precision, exactly what one Kethai female who has nothing left to lose can do to an extraction operation in mountain terrain for as long as it takes. I am patient. I have been in this mountain my entire life. I know every passage, every crack, every place where granite talks to water. You are an occupying force from 3 star clusters away. Eventually, you will run supply chains and maintenance schedules that I will disrupt. And eventually, the extraction projections will become so far from reality that your employers will withdraw the contract. I am simply offering to accelerate that timeline. There is one condition: the Kethi captives in your processing facility. They are to be released unharmed to the lower valley, all of them. The girl who delivered this message will confirm their release. After that, you and I have nothing further to discuss. He set the document down on his desk. He looked at the girl. He looked at the document. He looked at the operational map on his wall, with its cluster of red markers indicating incidents over the past 6 weeks, and he spent a long moment considering the spatial logic of those markers, how they moved, what they targeted, what they avoided, and what that avoidance told him about the intelligence doing the targeting. Then he looked at the extraction projections that his employers were expecting in 17 days. Then he looked at the girl again. She was sitting cross-legged on his floor. She had, at some point, produced a piece of dried something from a pocket and was eating it with the studied nonchalance of someone who had decided that if she was going to be in this room, she might as well be comfortable. "Tell her," Sekvethrin said to the girl, in halting Kethi that his translation database was still working through, "that I need 2 days." The girl stopped eating. She considered him with those amber-yellow eyes. "She said you would say that," Drav told him. "She also said to tell you that she knows you're not going to signal for reinforcements, because the signal would admit to your employers that you've had a 51-day active insurgency on a world you reported as pacified." Sekvethrin was quiet for a moment. "She is," he said, "extremely annoying." "Yes," said Drav, "she is also right." The captives came out 2 days later, in the early morning, walking out of the processing facility's secondary gate in a long, quiet line. There were 48 of them. She watched from the ridge above, from a position she had taken before the first light came up, lying still in the cold with her chin resting on her arms, and the blood moon setting behind the western peaks in a smear of rust and amber. She watched them come out. She watched them look around. She watched several of them turn their faces up to the open sky with expressions she did not need to see clearly to understand. She watched a Kethi female near the back of the group hold something up, she couldn't see what at this distance, and then hold it against her chest. She stayed on the ridge until all 48 had cleared the perimeter and moved into the valley toward the lower caves, where her 5 contact points were waiting to receive them. Then she stayed another hour, watching the facility, watching the movement of soldiers inside the perimeter, watching the loading that had begun at the northern landing pad. 2 days and they were already packing. Sekvethrin was, she admitted, thorough. He had done the arithmetic properly. She was aware, lying there in the cold, of the size of the silence around her. No carol, no crown that fit right, a leg that would never again be quite what it was. 47 days of being dead, which left a mark in ways that were hard to quantify, but that she felt in the particular way the dawn looked, the particular way the mountain smelled, the way cold air on the back of her neck registered now as something to be grateful for rather than something simply present. She heard footsteps, quiet, deliberate, the kind of footsteps that were trying to be quieter than they were, and she did not need to turn to know who it was. "They're loading," Drav said, settling beside her with the unself-conscious ease of a child claiming territory. "Yes. They'll be gone by tomorrow. By tonight if Sekvethrin is in a hurry," she paused, "he will be in a hurry." Drav was quiet for a moment watching the facility. Then, "What do we do when they come back? Because they'll come back." He said, I heard him, when he was talking to his adjutant. He said this valley has 12 years of extraction potential, and his employers won't release the contract. "He's right." So they'll come back. Yes. With better models. Yes. And then what? She considered the question. She turned it over the way she had been turning over questions in the dark of the caves for 47 days, not looking for comfort in the answer, not looking for the answer to be other than what it was. She was thinking about the girl beside her, about the 48 walking through the valley below, about the 5 hiding in the deep passages who had decided, without being asked, to start doing what she was doing, about the child in the root cellar for 11 days on the smell of stored tubers, who had walked into a Veilcon operations facility and sat cross-legged on the floor and eaten dried food with the equanimity of a monarch, about what one person with nothing left to lose could do to an extraction operation in mountain terrain for as long as it took, about how as long as it takes was not a threat or a boast, it was simply a number, and the Kethai had always been very good at surviving until the number ran out. Then, she said, we know more than we knew this time. Drav thought about this, and we're better at it. And we're better at it. Another silence. The loading continued below. A Veilcon shuttle lifted off from the northern pad in a column of compressed air, rose to the low overcast, and was gone. Can I ask you something? Drav said. Yes. Were you afraid in the mountain when you were supposed to be dead? She considered the question honestly, the way she had tried to consider every question for 43 years. Yes, she said, not of dying, of what it would mean if I didn't. Drav nodded slowly, the nod of someone filing information under useful. They lay there together on the ridge as the sun cleared the eastern peaks, and the valley below woke up gray and cold, and still theirs. She could hear, faint and far below, the sound of Kethai voices coming up from the direction of the lower caves, greetings, the particular register of people who had not seen each other in months, and were in the process of confirming each other's continued existence. It was not a large sound. It was not a triumphant sound. It was the sound of people who had survived one round and were already, without ceremony, beginning to think about the next. She put her hand on the back of her neck where the cold air moved, and she let herself feel it, the temperature, the altitude, the specific weight of the mountain air at this height, the small detailed fact of being alive in the particular moment she was alive in, before the next thing and the next and the next. Then she sat up, tested the crooked leg, found it solid enough. Come on, she said to Drav. There's work to do before the cold sets in. They came down the ridge together, the widow queen who had died in the mountain and the girl who had carried her voice into the enemy's heart, moving through the gray morning toward the sound of their people, toward the long work of everything that came next. The iron crown sat crooked on her head. The limp was real and permanent. The mountain was still theirs. She had not fallen. Not yet, not today. Not while there was breath in her chest and rock under her feet, and a people who needed the thing they needed from her, which was not heroics and not miracles, but simply the sight of her, upright and moving, and looking at the next problem with the same even gaze she had brought to every problem since she was old enough to understand that problems did not care how tired you were when they arrived. The blood moon had set. The ordinary sun was up. The valley was cold and gray and scarred and absolutely, unremarkably, stubbornly alive. Waugar, the one who does not fall, came home.